Some destinies don't arrive with a crown. They bleed quietly on your doorstep. Before the moon climbed above the towering pines of Blackridge Forest, Evelyn Carter had already accepted that the world had forgotten her. The small cabin she called home stood nearly 3 miles beyond the nearest pack trail, where even wandering wolves rarely ventured unless they had lost their way. Most called the place lonely. Evelyn called it peaceful. It was easier to hear the wind than cruel whispers. Easier to listen to birds than the laughter of those who believed an omega without status was worth less than the smallest spark in a winter fire. She lived simply, earning a few dollars by mending torn coats, repairing blankets, and stitching worn work gloves for travelers who never stayed long enough to remember her name. Her late father had taught her every careful stitch before illness carried him away years earlier. A steady hand can save more lives than a sharp sword, he used to say, though few in the pack ever believed such words. Strength belonged to alphas. Glory belonged to warriors. Kindness belonged to people no one noticed. That evening the rain began just after sunset, gentle at first before settling into a steady rhythm against the cedar roof. Evelyn sat beside the fireplace, repairing the sleeve of an old hunting jacket beneath the warm glow of an oil lamp. The room smelled of pine wood, fresh herbs, and lavender drying near the window. Every stitch moved with quiet precision, each thread pulled tight with the patience only years of practice could teach. Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. 3 slow knocks echoed against her front door. Evelyn froze, the needle suspended between her fingers. Nobody visited after dark. Not here. Not ever. For a long moment, only rain answered the silence. She rose cautiously, carrying the lamp toward the entrance. The wooden floor creaked beneath each careful step. Another knock followed, weaker this time, as though whoever stood outside had almost no strength left. Her hand rested against the latch. Every lesson about survival whispered that she should ignore it. A woman living alone beyond pack borders could not afford reckless compassion. But another lesson, one her father had repeated more often than any other, spoke louder inside her heart. If someone reaches your door in pain, you open it. Evelyn slowly pulled the door inward. Cold rain rushed inside with the wind. At first she saw nothing except darkness and falling water. Then the lantern light reached a figure collapsed against the porch railing. A man lay motionless, his dark coat soaked by rain, one gloved hand still stretched toward the doorway, as though he had refused to surrender until the very last step. His face remained partly hidden beneath wet strands of black hair, but even in the dim light, she could tell he was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His features carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command without raising his voice. A long tear crossed the shoulder of his coat, and beneath the damp fabric she noticed several carefully wrapped bandages that had already begun to loosen from days of travel. Whoever had tended them before had done all they could, but the journey had undone every careful effort. Evelyn knelt beside him without hesitation, gently checking his breathing. Slow, faint, steady enough to offer hope. As she reached to lift his wrist, something caught her eye. Resting beneath the torn sleeve was an unfamiliar silver marking unlike any pack crest she had ever encountered, faintly reflecting the lantern's glow before disappearing beneath the rain. She frowned, believing it to be nothing more than an unusual piece of jewelry. She had no way of knowing that somewhere deep within Blackridge Forest, hundreds of wolves were already searching through the storm for the missing ruler they feared they might never find. The stranger did not wake when Evelyn managed to guide him inside, although every movement drew a faint crease across his peaceful expression, as if even unconsciousness could not completely shield him from whatever burden he carried. She eased him onto the narrow wooden bed beside the fireplace, removed his rain-soaked coat, and quietly set it across a chair to dry. The fire crackled softly, filling the small cabin with welcome warmth while droplets of rain slowly gathered beneath the boots he had never managed to remove himself. Evelyn knelt beside the bed and studied the old bandages wrapped around his shoulder and ribs. Whoever had cared for him before had known enough to stop the bleeding, but the long journey through cold rain had soaked every layer of cloth until they clung heavily against his skin. She filled a kettle with fresh spring water, added dried chamomile and rosemary from the shelves above the stove, and waited patiently while the herbs released their gentle fragrance into the room. Her father had always believed that healing began by calming fear before treating pain, and although the stranger could not hear her while he slept, she still moved with the same quiet respect she offered everyone who crossed her doorway. Carefully, she loosened the worn bandages, revealing several deep cuts that had already begun to close naturally, far faster than anything she had witnessed before. She paused, puzzled. Even the strongest hunters from the local pack usually needed weeks to recover from injuries like these. Yet this man seemed determined to heal despite exhaustion, as though his body refused to surrender. Evelyn reached for her sewing kit, opening the small wooden box that had belonged to her father. Inside rested polished needles, clean linen thread, tiny scissors, and carefully folded cloth strips prepared for moments exactly like this. She threaded the needle with practiced hands and began repairing the torn edges of one wound after another. Every stitch was small, even, and steady. She never hurried. Every pull of the thread restored not only damaged skin, but also a little of the dignity that illness and hardship often stole from people. The cabin remained almost perfectly silent except for the gentle sound of rain tapping the windows and the soft breathing of the stranger. Hours passed unnoticed. Once, his eyes fluttered open only halfway before closing again. His lips barely moved. "Do not let them find me," he whispered so quietly that she almost believed she had imagined the words. Evelyn looked toward the frosted window, wondering who could frighten a man who looked as though he had walked through every storm the mountains could create. She answered in little more than a whisper herself. "You are safe here." He did not respond. Instead, his breathing gradually became calmer, and the tightness across his brow slowly disappeared. Evelyn gently covered him with the thick quilt stitched by her grandmother decades earlier before placing another log onto the fire. Just as she finished cleaning the last of her supplies, a distant howl echoed somewhere beyond the trees. Then another answered from farther away. Soon the forest carried several voices instead of one, rising and fading through the rain like an invisible surge spreading across the mountains. Evelyn stepped closer to the window, unable to see beyond the darkness. Yet something about the sound felt different from ordinary pack patrols. These wolves were not hunting. They were searching desperately. Behind her, the stranger's hand tightened around the edge of the blanket, as though some instinct deep within him had recognized those distant voices. Beneath the loose sleeve of his shirt, the strange silver marking near his wrist shimmered for only a heartbeat before fading once more, while miles away, riders carrying the royal crest silently changed direction toward the forgotten cabin that no map considered important. Morning arrived quietly beneath a blanket of silver mist, and for the first time in many years, Evelyn found herself preparing breakfast for someone besides herself. The stranger still slept, although the color had begun to return to his face, replacing the pale exhaustion that had frightened her the night before. She stirred a pot of warm vegetable broth over the fire while fresh bread baked slowly inside the small iron oven built by her father years ago. Outside, birds welcomed the sunrise with cheerful songs, almost pretending the storm had never existed. The peaceful rhythm of the cabin slowly returned, yet Evelyn could not ignore the feeling that everything around her had somehow changed. When she checked the stranger's bandages, she noticed something impossible. The careful stitches she had sewn only hours earlier looked as though they had been healing for several days. The swelling had faded almost completely, and the warmth beneath his skin felt healthy rather than feverish. She frowned, gently touching the edge of one bandage before quietly replacing it. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she expected no answer. Instead, the man shifted slightly beneath the blanket, his breathing becoming uneven as another dream pulled him deeper into memories he could not escape. His lips moved again, this time forming words more clearly than before. "The northern gate, do not open the gate." His voice carried calm authority even while asleep, the kind that came naturally to someone accustomed to giving orders that others obeyed without question. Then his expression softened unexpectedly. "Mother." The single word carried so much quiet sorrow that Evelyn instinctively reached for his hand. She did not think about it. She simply rested her fingers gently against his, offering the same silent comfort she had once wished someone had given her after losing her own parents. Almost immediately, the tension disappeared from his face. His breathing slowed. The restless movement stopped. For several peaceful moments, the entire cabin seemed to settle into stillness with him. Evelyn smiled faintly before withdrawing her hand, believing nothing more of the small gesture. She spent the rest of the morning repairing clothes beside the window while occasionally glancing toward the bed to make sure he remained comfortable. She never searched his pockets. She never questioned the expensive fabric of his shirt or the unusual silver crest woven almost invisibly into the lining of his coat. Those things did not matter to her. A wounded traveler was still a person deserving kindness, whether he arrived wearing patchwork clothes or garments fit for nobility. Shortly after noon, hoofbeats echoed faintly somewhere beyond the trees. Evelyn looked outside but saw only drifting sunlight falling through the pines. The riders never approached close enough to appear, yet their presence lingered like a shadow moving through the forest. She quietly closed the curtains before returning to her sewing. Moments later, the stranger's eyes opened for the first time. Clear silver, calm, watchful. They scanned the ceiling, the fireplace, the wooden shelves, and finally settled upon Evelyn without a single word. She looked up from her stitching and offered the same gentle smile she greeted every customer with. "You are awake," she said softly. "You have been resting for almost a day." He studied her carefully, saying nothing, as though measuring every detail of the quiet woman sitting only a few feet away. Finally, he asked in a low, controlled voice, "Why did you help me?" Evelyn blinked, surprised by the question more than the man himself. She lowered her needle onto the table and answered with complete honesty. "Because you needed someone." No hesitation, no request for payment, no curiosity about his name. The stranger continued watching her in thoughtful silence. And for the first time in many years, someone spoke to the most feared man in the Northern Territories without fear, without expectation, and without realizing exactly who sat before her. The stranger accepted the bowl of warm broth with steady hands, although Evelyn noticed the careful way he measured every movement, as if he were testing whether his strength had truly returned. He thanked her with quiet sincerity before taking a slow sip, and for several peaceful minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, sunlight filtered through the tall pines, scattering shifting patterns across the cabin floor, while the afternoon breeze carried the scent of cedar and wildflowers through the open window. Evelyn returned to repairing a faded quilt that had been waiting for weeks, allowing him the space to recover without questions. She had never believed kindness required explanations. Across the room, the stranger observed everything with remarkable attention. His eyes lingered on the carefully organized shelves, the neatly folded blankets, the polished sewing tools, and the tiny carved wooden wolf resting beside the fireplace. Nothing inside the cabin suggested wealth or influence, yet every object reflected care, patience, and quiet dignity. It was a life untouched by ambition, built instead upon simple acts repeated faithfully every day. He found himself wondering how someone who had been given so little could still offer so much without expecting anything in return. Before either of them spoke again, 3 firm knocks echoed against the front door. The stranger immediately set the bowl aside, every trace of calm disappearing behind an expression sharpened by instinct. His silver eyes shifted toward the entrance, then toward the nearby window, silently calculating distances and possibilities. Evelyn noticed the sudden tension but misunderstood its cause. "You should stay here," she said gently. "It is probably only someone needing a coat repaired." Without waiting for an answer, she walked toward the door and opened it just enough to greet the visitors. 2 patrol wolves from the neighboring pack stood outside wearing dark traveling cloaks marked with the local crest. Their horses waited quietly behind them. The older guard offered a polite nod before speaking. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter. We are searching every cabin along the northern border. Has anyone unfamiliar passed through here since last night?" Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken, though her face remained composed. She glanced only briefly toward the forest instead of looking back into the cabin. "No," she answered honestly enough for her own conscience. The storm kept everyone indoors. The younger guard peered past her shoulder with open curiosity. "Would you mind if we looked around? We received reports that an injured traveler may have entered this part of the forest." Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before stepping slightly into the doorway, unintentionally narrowing the entrance with her own body. "My cabin is very small," she replied with an apologetic smile. Only sewing supplies, herbs, and unfinished work. I have customers waiting for repairs before winter arrives. The older guards studied her expression carefully. Everyone in the nearby settlements knew Evelyn rarely lied, and that reputation now protected far more than she realized. After several quiet seconds, the guard nodded. Very well. If you notice anyone unusual, send word immediately. Of course, Evelyn answered. She watched them ride away until the sound of hoofbeats faded beneath the whispering trees. Only then did she close the door and release the breath she had unconsciously been holding. When she turned around, the stranger was already standing despite his recent injuries. His posture carried effortless authority even inside the modest cabin. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite understand, somewhere between surprise and quiet admiration. You protected someone you do not even know, he said softly. Evelyn simply shrugged and picked up the abandoned bowl from the table. Sometimes people deserve a chance to heal before the world starts asking questions. The stranger lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as though her words had reached a place inside him that years of loyalty, power, and victory never had. While hidden beneath the drying folds of his weathered coat, the silver crest embroidered into the fabric shimmered once beneath the afternoon light before disappearing again. As evening settled gently over Blackridge Forest, an unusual stillness spread through the towering pines. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, as though the woods themselves were listening for something hidden beyond ordinary hearing. Evelyn carried a basket outside to gather fresh rosemary and thyme before nightfall, leaving the stranger resting beside the fire with strict instructions to remain indoors. He had given no name, and she had not asked for one. Somehow that unspoken agreement made the quiet between them feel even more natural. She moved carefully through the small herb garden behind the cabin, trimming only what she needed while the cool breeze carried the scent of cedar across the clearing. When she straightened, she noticed something that immediately stopped her. Along the edge of the trees stood a massive gray wolf. Then another appeared several yards away. A third stepped silently from the shadows. Within moments, nearly a dozen wolves surrounded the clearing, their thick coats glowing silver beneath the rising moon. Evelyn instinctively held her breath. She had lived near the forest long enough to recognize danger, yet none of the wolves bared their teeth or lowered their ears. Instead, they simply watched the cabin with calm, unwavering attention. One by one, each wolf slowly lowered its head. It was not the posture of hunters preparing to attack. It resembled respect, or perhaps obedience. Evelyn frowned, unable to understand what she was witnessing. Wild wolves did not behave this way. They did not gather in perfect silence, and they certainly did not appear to be waiting for permission from someone they could not yet see. Before she could take another step, the cabin door opened behind her. The stranger emerged into the evening air, his movements far steadier than they had been that morning. The moment he crossed the threshold, every wolf lowered its head even farther. The entire clearing became perfectly still. The stranger stopped walking. His silver eyes met the gaze of the largest wolf without a single spoken word. Something invisible seemed to pass between them, a conversation beyond human hearing. After several long seconds, the great wolf stepped backward, turned gracefully toward the forest, and disappeared among the trees. The others followed immediately until only empty shadows remained beneath the pines. Evelyn stared after them in complete disbelief. That has never happened before, she whispered. The stranger remained silent for a moment before answering carefully. Animals often recognize things that people overlook. His calm reply explained nothing, yet it sounded as though he had chosen every word with great care. Evelyn looked at him more closely. The moonlight reflected across his face, revealing quiet confidence instead of uncertainty. Whatever weakness had filled his expression the night before had nearly vanished. She smiled with genuine relief. You are recovering much faster than I expected. He glanced toward the forest before returning his attention to her. That is because someone refused to leave me alone in the rain. His voice carried quiet gratitude. Although it remained touched by a sadness she still could not understand. Together they returned inside as the evening grew colder. While Evelyn prepared fresh tea, the stranger picked up the worn wooden wolf carving from the mantel. He turned it thoughtfully in his hands before asking, "Did your father make this?" She nodded with a soft smile. He believed every wolf carried two strengths. One protected the body, the other protected the heart. He always said the second one mattered more. The stranger looked down at the small carving for several silent moments, as though remembering words he had not heard in many years. Then, without realizing it, he smiled for the first time since arriving at the cabin. It was small and almost imperceptible, but it transformed the weariness in his face into something unexpectedly warm. Evelyn noticed it immediately, though she said nothing. Outside, hidden beyond the trees where no human eyes could see, cloaked riders silently observed the cabin from a distant ridge. None dared approach. Their leaders simply watched the faint light glowing through the window and whispered with quiet relief, "He is alive." Yet even they could not understand why the alpha they had sworn to protect had chosen to remain inside the humble home of an unknown Omega instead of returning to the throne that had been waiting for him. The next morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by the passing storm, and warm sunlight poured through the cabin windows as though the forest itself had decided to breathe again. Evelyn was already outside collecting fresh water from the nearby spring when she noticed something unusual. The footprints leading away from the cabin belonged to only one person, yet they stopped abruptly near the tree line without returning. She hurried back, setting the wooden bucket beside the porch before looking around the clearing. The stranger was gone. Her heart tightened with unexpected concern. He was recovering quickly, but no one healed completely after only a few days of rest. She quietly followed the trail toward the deeper woods, careful not to disturb the morning stillness. The forest welcomed her with gentle birdsong and beams of golden light slipping between ancient branches. After nearly half a mile, she reached a rocky overlook where the trees opened toward a wide valley below. There he stood, facing the distant mountains. With his back to her, his posture was perfectly straight, calm and composed, as though he belonged to the wilderness itself. The morning breeze carried through his dark hair while his coat moved softly behind him. For a long moment, he remained completely still. Then several wolves emerged from the surrounding forest. They appeared one after another without making a sound, forming a quiet circle several yards away. None approached him directly. None threatened him. Instead, every wolf lowered its head with unmistakable respect. Evelyn stopped behind a tall cedar, watching in silent amazement. She had seen the wolves outside her cabin the previous evening, but witnessing the same impossible behavior again made coincidence impossible to believe. The stranger slowly raised one hand. No words were spoken. No command echoed through the trees. Yet every wolf lifted its head at the same moment before calmly retreating into the forest exactly as they had come. Within seconds, only drifting leaves remained. Evelyn stepped forward, unable to hide her curiosity any longer. He turned toward her immediately, almost as though he had sensed her presence long before she revealed herself. For a brief instant, surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by quiet composure. "You should not be walking this far," he said gently. Evelyn smiled, slightly out of breath from the climb. "I was about to tell you the same thing." The corners of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. "I needed fresh air." She glanced toward the place where the wolves had disappeared. "Those wolves were not afraid of you." He followed her gaze before answering with deliberate calm. Perhaps they simply recognized a familiar soul. His reply raised more questions than it answered, but Evelyn sensed he was protecting something rather than deceiving her. She respected that silence. Together, they began walking back toward the cabin along the narrow forest path. As they crossed a small wooden bridge over a clear stream, the stranger slowed. The rushing water reflected sunlight across the polished stones below. He looked at the current for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "You still do not know my name?" Evelyn shrugged lightly. "When you are ready to tell me, you will." He looked at her with genuine surprise. Most people demanded answers. Most measured others by titles, family names, or influence. She measured people by kindness instead. After another thoughtful silence, he finally said, "My name is Damien." She repeated it with a warm smile. "It suits you." Hearing his own name spoken without fear, expectation, or ceremony stirred something inside him that had remained untouched for years. As they continued toward the cabin, neither of them noticed the faint shimmer that spread briefly beneath the final stitch Evelyn had sewn across his shoulder. Hidden beneath the fabric, the silver mark near his wrist glowed softly before settling into a new shape. as though an ancient promise had quietly awakened, waiting only for the right moment to reveal a truth that neither Damien nor Evelyn could yet imagine. 3 peaceful days passed before the silence surrounding the little cabin finally broke. Damien had regained enough strength to help split firewood, repair the loose fence beside the herb garden, and carry fresh water from the spring despite Evelyn insisting that he should continue resting. He listened only half the time, offering the same quiet smile whenever she reminded him not to overwork himself. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with simple concern instead of careful obedience, and although he never admitted it aloud, every ordinary moment inside the small cabin felt strangely precious. That afternoon, the forest breeze carried the scent of approaching rain once again, but another sound soon followed. Hoofbeats. Many of them. They echoed steadily through the trees, growing louder with every passing second until they finally stopped beyond the clearing. Evelyn looked up from the basket of herbs she had been sorting while Damien slowly set down the axe resting against the chopping block. Their eyes met for only a brief moment. He already knew who had arrived. A line of riders emerged between the towering pines, each wearing dark cloaks fastened with polished silver clasps shaped like wolves beneath a crescent moon. Their horses stood, perfectly disciplined, their armor gleaming beneath the afternoon light. Unlike the local patrol Evelyn had seen before, these riders carried themselves with unmistakable confidence. They did not belong to an ordinary pack. The moment the leading rider saw Damien standing beside the cabin, he immediately dismounted. One after another, every rider followed. Without hesitation, each of them lowered to one knee. The clearing fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Evelyn stared in stunned disbelief as the leader bowed his head deeply before speaking with unmistakable respect. Your Majesty, we have searched every corner of the Northern Territories. We are grateful beyond words that you are safe. The words seemed to hang motionless in the air. Evelyn slowly turned toward Damien. For several heartbeats, she could not speak. The quiet traveler she had welcomed into her home, the man whose wounds she had stitched beside her fireplace, the stranger who had thanked her for a bowl of soup, stood calmly before an entire royal guard who refused to rise until he acknowledged them. Damien closed his eyes briefly, almost regretfully, before looking at Evelyn. There was no pride in his expression, only quiet honesty. I wanted to tell you, he said softly, but for the first time in many years, I was able to live as only a man instead of a king. Evelyn searched his face, replaying every conversation they had shared, every quiet smile, every unanswered question. Suddenly the wolves that had bowed before him, the mysterious silver mark, the impossible speed of his recovery, and the distant riders watching from the forest all fit together like pieces of a puzzle she had never realized she was solving. The leader of the guard finally raised his eyes. Alpha King Damien Blackwood, he announced with solemn pride. The council awaits your return. The entire kingdom has feared the worst. Hearing the full name spoken aloud sent a wave of astonishment through Evelyn. She had heard stories of the Alpha King since childhood. Every tale described an undefeated ruler whose strength had united the Northern Territories and whose presence alone commanded absolute respect. None of those stories had mentioned the quiet man who thanked her before every meal or patiently repaired a broken fence without being asked. Damien stepped toward her, his voice remaining gentle despite the dozens of eyes watching. Evelyn, everything they said is true, but there is one truth they still do not know. He glanced briefly toward the neat stitches hidden beneath his shirt before meeting her eyes once more. Without your kindness, none of them would be standing here today. Around them, the royal guard remained kneeling in complete silence, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn Carter realized that the forgotten Omega everyone overlooked had unknowingly changed the fate of an entire kingdom. The royal guard remained perfectly still until Damien finally raised one hand, giving the silent command to stand. One by one they rose without question, yet none dared look directly at Evelyn for more than a passing moment. She could feel their curiosity as clearly as the cool breeze drifting through the clearing. To them, she was simply an unknown Omega standing beside the Alpha King as though they had been sharing ordinary conversations for days. Damien stepped toward the captain of the guard and quietly accepted the dark traveling cloak offered to him. The silver clasp shaped like a wolf beneath a crescent moon reflected the afternoon sunlight, confirming beyond all doubt that he truly belonged to the throne everyone had spoken about for years. Before fastening it, however, he turned back toward Evelyn. "There is something all of you should understand," he said, his calm voice carrying effortlessly across the clearing. Every guard immediately lowered his head in respectful silence. This woman opened her home when she had every reason to close her door. She expected nothing in return. She asked no questions. She saw a wounded traveler, not a king. His words settled over the clearing with quiet strength. No one interrupted. No one challenged him. The captain placed one hand across his chest before bowing toward Evelyn with the same respect he had shown Damien moments earlier. "Miss Carter, the Northern Crown owes you a debt that cannot be measured." Evelyn immediately shook her head, almost embarrassed by the attention. "I only did what anyone should have done." Damien looked at her with the faint smile she had come to recognize during the past few days. "That is exactly why it matters." He turned toward the waiting riders once more. "If I had not reached this cabin, the council would already be preparing for uncertainty across the northern territories. Neighboring pacts would question the stability of the throne. Old rivalries would awaken. Fear spreads quickly when leadership disappears." Evelyn listened quietly, only now beginning to understand the weight one life could carry. She had believed she was helping a single stranger survive a difficult journey. Instead, her simple act of kindness had quietly protected countless families who would never know her name. The realization left her speechless. Damien walked toward the porch where his weathered coat still hung drying beside the door. As he lifted it from the chair, something slipped from an inner pocket and landed softly on the wooden floor. Evelyn bent down first and picked it up. It was the small silver emblem she had noticed only briefly days before, polished now by the afternoon light. She held it carefully before offering it back to him. Damien accepted it with a thoughtful expression. "This belonged to my father," he said softly. "He carried it until the day I became Alpha King." For a brief moment, both of them stood in comfortable silence, remembering different parents who had shaped the people they had become. Finally, Damien looked toward the cabin that had sheltered him when no palace could. His gaze lingered on the little herb garden, the repaired fence, the stacked firewood, and the warm light glowing behind the windows. "Evelyn," he said gently, "I would like you to come to Blackwood Castle as my honored guest." She blinked in surprise, instinctively glancing toward her modest home. "I do not belong in a castle," Damien answered without the slightest hesitation. "Kindness belongs wherever people have forgotten its value." None of the royal guard spoke, yet several exchanged quiet glances. They had served their king for many years, but they had never heard him speak with such warmth or certainty. As the horses prepared for the journey home, none of them realized that the greatest challenge waiting inside Blackwood Castle would not come from distant enemies or rival packs, but from those who believed an unknown Omega could never deserve a place beside their king. The journey to Blackwood Castle began the following morning beneath a clear blue sky. Yet Evelyn could not bring herself to look back at the little cabin until the trees finally hid it from view. It had been her entire world for years, a quiet place where no one expected anything from her except honest work and gentle hands. Now she rode beside Damien through the endless forests of the Northern Territories while members of the Royal Guard surrounded them with silent vigilance. No one spoke unless Damien did first, and even then every answer was measured with deep respect. The farther they traveled, the more villages appeared along the winding roads. People stopped what they were doing the moment they recognized the royal crest. Farmers removed their hats. Merchants bowed their heads. Children waved with bright smiles before their parents gently reminded them to stand respectfully as the Alpha King passed. Evelyn watched everything with quiet amazement. She had heard stories about the kingdom all her life, yet seeing the trust people placed in Damien revealed a truth no legend had ever captured. They did not respect him because they feared him. They respected him because they believed he would protect them. Several hours later, the towers of Blackwood Castle rose above the ancient forest like part of the mountain itself. Sunlight reflected from the stone walls while hundreds of silver banners moved gently in the afternoon breeze. The sight stole Evelyn's breath. She had never imagined a place so magnificent could truly exist. As the gates slowly opened, rows of royal attendants and castle guards gathered along the entrance courtyard. Every person bowed as Damien rode through, But when their eyes drifted toward Evelyn, quiet whispers immediately spread through the crowd. She lowered her gaze, suddenly aware that her simple, traveling dress looked painfully ordinary beside polished uniforms and elegant gowns. Before uncertainty could settle into her heart, Damien dismounted and walked directly to her horse. Ignoring every curious glance around them, he offered his hand with calm confidence. Evelyn accepted it, stepping onto the stone courtyard beside him. Instead of walking ahead as tradition expected, Damien remained beside her. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet everyone watching understood its meaning. She was not arriving as an unnoticed visitor. She was under the personal protection of the Alpha King himself. Inside the grand entrance hall, warm afternoon light poured through towering windows, illuminating ancient carvings that told the history of generations before Damien's reign. Near the center of the hall stood an elderly woman wearing a silver robe embroidered with delicate moonflowers. Her gentle eyes rested on Evelyn almost immediately. Without speaking, she slowly approached until only a few feet separated them. Then, to everyone's surprise, she carefully took Evelyn's hands into her own. Her expression softened with quiet wonder. "These hands," she whispered, "carry the blessing of someone who heals without asking who deserves healing." The room fell completely silent. Damien looked at the elderly woman with thoughtful curiosity. She was the oldest keeper of the kingdom's sacred records, respected for preserving traditions older than anyone could remember. She turned one of Evelyn's hands toward the sunlight streaming through the window. A faint silver glow appeared along the tips of her fingers before disappearing almost instantly. Several attendants gasped softly. The elderly woman smiled through eyes filled with ancient memories. "Long before either of you were born," she said, "our oldest prophecies spoke of a king whose life would not be saved by strength, but by compassion freely given. It also spoke of a healer whose ordinary hands would awaken an extraordinary future." Evelyn looked at Damien in complete disbelief. Damien remained silent, yet his eyes never left hers. In that single quiet moment, they both understood the same truth. The night of forgotten. Omega chose kindness instead of fear had never been an accident. It had been the first step in a destiny written long before either of them took their first breath, and somewhere beyond the castle walls, beneath the same moon that had quietly guided them together, an even greater chapter of their story had only just begun. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment, and what message or lesson did you take away from Evelyn and Damien's journey? Share your opinion in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Alpha's Regret Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting story filled with romance, drama, betrayal, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.